Good evening, everyone. So my name is Mateusz Fałkowski. I'm happy to announce the second lecture, open lecture during our Exercising Modernity Academy this year. And this lecture will be held by Mikanowski. Mikanowski is historian and journalist based in Portland, Oregon. He studied European history at Princeton and received his PhD in Eastern European history from the University of California at Berkeley. This is the university where also Czesław Miłosz taught courses on Eastern European history and history of literature. So maybe it has some meaning. So yes, so this, and he's author of numerous articles for papers and journals in America and in United Kingdom. And but first of all, he's author of a book, Goodbye Eastern Europe, an intimate history of a divided land. And this is the reason why we invited Jakob here as a keynote speaker. And Jakob, the floor is yours.
Do some logging in. Okay. All right. Thank you so much for having me at this wonderful conference. I want to thank Mateusz and Patrick and Vitold and everyone who helped organize this and bring me all the way from faraway Portland, 9 time zones, to come here tonight and give this talk, which I've got set up. I want to do a little bit of technology check. Sorry. Yes, good. Everything seems like it works. Okay. So I was invited to come here and give this talk. I immediately had an intuition of what I wanted to talk about. I had a phrase come into mind, and the phrase is orphan memory. And I'm going to do something a little bit self-indulgent in this talk, so I hope you bear with me and are patient, because I'm going to try to coin a phrase, which I think sometimes is useful and sometimes, falls flat. But I want to give a name to a feeling. So I spent a couple years kind of in exile from grad school. I wasn't quite done with my dissertation. It was kind of on the rocks, but I was working as a journalist. I was trying to work more on Eastern Europe as a wider field, as a bigger, I was working mostly on Polish history, but trying to find a place as a writer about a larger region and find a way to communicate about the larger region to people, frankly, who didn't know that much about it. And so normally I talk to audiences in the UK or in America where the level of knowledge about Eastern Europe is very low. And I do a lot of translating and trying to bring people aboard. Today I feel like it's the exact opposite, where you know much more than me, and I'm bringing you this much dumbed down version that hopefully in its generality has something maybe to connect different work that you're doing, maybe has some relevance in pieces, maybe some of the stories will be interesting or boring. That's always a possibility too. But in spending about 5 years working on this book, I did a lot of traveling around Eastern Europe, from Latvia to Albania, always centered in Poland, always coming back to Poland. That's kind of my family's from Warsaw, I was going back to Warsaw. And encountering a certain kind of feeling, encountering a certain kind of experience sort of in the field that now I want to give a name to. So when I was writing the conclusion of the book, I had to sum everything up. 1,000 years, again, very general, very much for this big audience. But having written about 1,000 years, having written about 3 empires in the 20th century and tried to gather my thoughts about everything, I had to sum it all up and say in a few words what it meant. And I had a few days left on my book deadline, so I had to work quickly. And I wrote something like this. Well, I actually wrote this. Today, even the memory of an older, more inclusive way of life seems to be ebbing away. And yet that too makes sense, as Eastern Europe is one of the world's great homelands of forgetting. Travel anywhere in this vast half-continent, and you are apt to come across abandoned temples, untended graves, and vanished sepulchres, foreign gods and other people's dead. It's that idea of a homeland of forgetting. That was kind of an impulsive, writer's impulse. And I think in an earlier version of the book, I wrote about orphan memory. And I assumed that I had taken that from somewhere, that was a term of art. And I looked it up, and it turns out it does mean something. It means something in computer memory, which I don't understand what that means at all. It means something in astrophysics, in the physics of gravitational waves. There's a concept of orphan memory, when the gravitational waves have no source. I also don't know what that means. So I'm going to try and talk about orphan memory in Eastern Europe, in our kind of familiar world of commemoration, memory politics, and untended memory, the memory that doesn't get commemorated. And I'll tell a few stories, try to make a point, and then try and come around at the end to talk about what we as workers, culture workers, curators, workers in art or architecture, how we can approach kind of different ways to approach these memory orphans that I'm trying to describe. But for some water. And then a story. So. And I'm sorry, most of the photos in this slide are my own photos, and they were taken, when you're traveling around doing a kind of photo diary of where I was going. So they are not the highest quality. A lot of them were made by a long deceased iPhone that died a hero's death in the field when I dropped it in a puddle and short-circuited. So not always the best images, but I'm hopefully gonna speak them to life. This is a spot that I think is on no one's tourist trail especially. This is Góra Kalwaria outside Warsaw. This is the Beit Midrash of the Gera Rebbe. And I think I visited this in 2021. And it's in so-so shape, as you can see. So why was I here? I started reading, I was writing about my chapter on Jewish history and Hasidic history, and got deep into Martin Buber and the tales of the great Hasidic masters. This incredible explosion of religious creativity in life, much of it happening in Poland, some of it in what's now Ukraine, some of it in Belarus, that now mostly lives on in literature and in kind of religious storytelling, the storytelling of the tzaddiks. But I found myself, if anyone reads Buber, you quickly get entranced in this world. And so first I went to Kotsk, I love Kotsk, to the house of Rabbi Menachem Mendel, the Kotsker Rebbe. This is the last of the first generation of Hasidic masters, the early masters, the ones who didn't have dynasties yet, who attracted their followers by preaching, by the rigor, by the personality, by the force of personal magnetism. And the story of Menachem Mendel was that he was this brilliant preacher, one of the kind of first in Lublin, and then set up his seat in Kotsk. And no, I'm changing on the computer. I'm forgetting that this is behind you. So this is the Gera Rebbe in Góra Kalwaria. This is Kotsk, Policja down the street. And the legend of Menachem Mendel is that at some point he suffered a crisis. After years of preaching, being the most rigorous of these masters, something went wrong. Something internally, something broke. There are different versions of what happened. We can get to that later. But he retreated into his tower. He went into his tower, sealed himself up for 19 years, didn't speak to anyone, supposedly preached to mice and frogs, and then died. And his followers were left to try and interpret this event, try and interpret what happened to him, try and rebuild the teaching and the tradition on their own. And in this, in the story, you see him sealed up in this great tower, speaking to no one. And then if you go, this is the tower. This is Menachem Mendel's tower. Kotsk, there it is. Not really a tower, just kind of a second story addition. And if you go across the street, Nikt nas nie zagryzł, nikt nas nie zaszczelił, no one shot us, no one bit us, but always nice to be welcome. But you go in search of atmosphere, you go in search of the story. And then one of his disciples, kind of the leading disciple, was the Gera Rebbe, the Rebbe of Gora Kalvaria. This is a close-up of his seat, I think built in the late 1890s or early 1900s, now in very poor shape. It was gutted by the Nazis, but not burnt down. It is structurally intact. It's run by the Gmina Żydowska. No one can go in. It's in perilous condition. You can see vines and almost small trees growing out of the front. A very atmospheric spot. And I went with my cousin and my wife and my cousin's husband, and we made a day of it. They'd go to Gora Kalvaria a lot because they bike there from Warsaw. And while I was there, we're in front of the building. We hear music. We hear celebrating. Something's going on. And we go next door into the main square. And no. I'm confused between this and that. Okay. It's the Russo-Bolshevik War. By chance, it's a reenactment of the War of 1920, the Polish-Soviet War, some commissars with ice cream on the way to the battle. My wife's taking documentary photojournalism in the field. And the whole town was doing this reenactment. There were children's divisions, there was nurses, there were 1920s cars, there was a 1920s band, and that was what Gora Kalvaria was living for. And the poor Ger Rebbe, in kind of state of dissolution. Although there's a plaque. I even ran into some people in front of it, and I'm like, "Are you here for the rabbi's house?" Like, they have no idea what I'm talking about, because they're of course here for this. And for me, this is a slightly silly story, but it underlined something you kept running into in my travels, that gulf between official commemoration and, we can get into whether deliberate forgetting, zapomnianie, this, the built environment that has its own memories and the official program of what should be remembered. And that's something you run into all over. This is outside Warsaw, but from Estonia to Albania, from Romania to Slovenia, this kind of gap between the remembered and the commemorated kept coming up. And between objects that hold memories and objects that seem to have those memories but be sort of forlorn, forsaken, because they've lost that connection to a society that used to give them that life. I should also say the Ger Rebbe used to be the great pilgrimage site for Warsaw Jews. It used to be a separate tram car that ran to Gora Kalvaria. Every Saturday, thousands of people, I think on the holidays, 30, 40, 50,000 would go to Gora Kalvaria to this rabbi's seat here. And now it's really, really in poor shape. Although you can see the Star of David in the window there. Okay. So in writing this talk, I wanted to, give a name to that sensation. And I had a couple candidates. We're going to play Goldilocks with them. And one of the best, I thought, was Roma Syndyka, the Polish anthropologist, professor at Jagiellonian University, who writes about non-sites of memory. So playing on Pierre Nora's idea of the lieu de mémoire, of the sites that he was writing about France and the culture of memory in France, the places that concentrate memory of events, that concentrate memories that give coherence to a French national story. There are sites that are especially important. He calls it the lieu de mémoire. And playing off of that, Roma Syndyka writes about the lieu de la non-mémoire. I actually think she takes that from someone else. But writing about that, this is a long quote, but she's writing in essence about places connected to the Shoah. Burial places, mass graves, killing sites, places that haven't been memorialized. So places that exist outside the complex of memorialization and commemoration. Places that can be burial sites, but they can also be demolished synagogues, vandalized cemeteries, and just places in the woods where there are mass graves. You know, writing about them, she says they share a certain affective aura that is difficult to rationalize. Something in these spaces is perceptibly off. And so this inversion of Pierre Noir's idea, populations topographically ascribed to them, so the local people, do not need or even actively do not want to invest their memory in them. They want to forget these locales, to not remember them. So places of kind of anti-memory. And expanding, because she at first and most writing about first campsites and mass graves, she kind of expands it in the course of a really brilliant essay to also include places connected to these events, like dilapidated areas of towns, abandoned houses, ruined cemeteries, pretty much kind of my milieu, as places of kind of enforced forgetting. And so that is partially in line with what I was looking for, but also seems too narrow for me. That this narrows the space of non-memory or forgetting strictly the places of active repression, places where people want to forget, don't want to remember something traumatic, and really connects them ultimately. She says that you can broaden this idea, I keep doing this, to other genocides, other mass killings. So that's, I think, a great intervention, but I was looking for something a little wider, because I think there's a bigger category across Eastern Europe, a category of existing in the built environment, and sometimes not even in the built environment, just in the land, in the landscape. That's a little broader than that. So turn to two other anthropologists. Dissonant heritage. I like that phrase. This comes from Turnbridge and Ashworth. I don't really know much about them, but Slovene anthropologist Katja Hrobat-Verloget, if I'm saying that right, used it in reference to Italian architecture in Slovenian Istria. So Slovenian Istria, also Croatian Istria, the coast there was heavily Italian. The cities were mostly Italian. The cityscape had a Venetian root, and then was inhabited by Italians up to 45, 46, 48, when they were encouraged to emigrate, forcibly expelled, frightened into leaving, a kind of in between, as Yugoslavia took over, consolidated over Slovenia, its hold over Slovenia, pushed them out, settled Slovenes from the interior in those cities. Slovenes without much personal connection to that built environment. So dissonant heritage, that dissonance comes from that sense of being in someone else's home. And if you work on po-niemieckie, the whole world of po-niemieckie, polskie, comes up again and again across Eastern Europe. Places vacated by someone, inhabited then by someone else. And that dissonance between who was there originally, who's there now. Another term for it, uncanny heritage. David Leupold, German, I think anthropologist, unless he's a sociologist, who writes really about Armenian remains in Eastern Turkey. And I'm talking about Eastern Europe today. What I'm saying about Eastern Europe applies equally well to Greece, to Turkey, to the Caucasus, and actually points east. We can get into where the kind of borders of orphan memory, how far they extend. So the background image here is an Armenian church in Eastern Turkey. Eastern Turkey is full of this sort of thing. Oh my God, I can't. Dissonance is in my brain, on heritage there. Whenever I seem to go off script, someone stop me, because I cannot do two things at once, apparently. I'm disappointed. And I like those two terms, dissonant heritage, uncanny heritage. But I also think that they're a little too narrow for what I want to describe. So we'll try and broaden the definition. There's the great Rosalind Krauss essay about sculpture in the expanded field. So we're trying to talk about memory in an expanded field and try to make a bigger basket, a bigger term. And for help with that, Maurice Halbwachs, great foundational scholar on collective memory. And chapter 4 of Collective Memory is about collective memory in space. And he writes that, no, I'm off balance. We understand spatial images play so important a role in the collective memory. Place and group have each received the imprint of the other. Each aspect, each detail of a place has meaning intelligent only to members of the group. For each portion of its space corresponds to various and different aspects of the structure and life of their society, at least what is most stable in it. The idea that collective memory makes space legible and space makes the collective legible, that there's an interrelationship. But I found it interesting, this phrase within that it reflects what is most stable in society, what is most enduring, what is most passed from generation to generation is written into the built environment, is written into the landscape. And when we are dealing with Eastern Europe in the 20th century, we're talking about places that are the most unstable, areas of chronic instability, where that relationship between space and memory keeps being severed, or becomes severed and has to be reestablished in some new way. But I do, we'll come back, I want to come back to this idea of memory making space legible. Okay, so we've rejected, and I have to say I like all these terms, but I want to reach for something a little bigger, and I need to go. So orphan memory, and this is where I'm being self-indulgent. I'm trying to get my own phrase across the starting line. I essentially see it as collective memory without the collective. To play off of Hollbach's, that collective memory that existed in a landscape, and then the collective disappears, vanishes, is expelled, emigrates. That sense of connection is broken. And I think that can happen in a number of ways. First, we'll talk about kind of physical destruction of communities, and then also excision of memory, deliberate forgetting of parts of history or styles of history that seem not to fit into contemporary narratives. I think those are two that are different, but can we fit them under one umbrella? Can we fit the spaces left behind under one umbrella? But first, so what is the collective that gets getting dismantled? I cannot keep this together, okay. In broad strokes, I'll kind of go back to, this is a 5-minute social history of Eastern Europe, so very in depth. The reasons for this, and I think to go back to the non-leader memoir, the Jewish cemetery in communities where there are no longer any Jews, it's a kind of paradigmatic example of this, and it's been used as the paradigm, and I want to kind of broaden out beyond that. This is the Jewish cemetery in my grandfather's home shtetl of Zambruv, which has about 1, maybe 2 gravestones left. And it's a kind of paradigmatic example of this orphan memory, but not the only kind. So immigration, expulsion, extermination, the Eastern Europe we're talking about before is this densely interwoven network, this tapestry of different ethnicities, religions, and nationalities living in very close proximity without clear, defined borders. This is one of my favorite maps, poorly captioned. This is an ethnographic map of the Habsburg Empire from 1855, and I zoomed in on an especially kind of diverse area. This is outside Timișoara in the corner. So this is part of Romania now, and Serbia, about 100 kilometers by 50 kilometers. Each color is a different language group. Serbo-Croats are green. They're not differentiated by religion. Light blue, light green is Slovene. Yellow is Romanian, or Wallachian in this case. White is Magyar. Yellow is Romanian, or Wallachian. This is actually kind of an oversimplification. This is one of the hardest things to get across to American listeners, UK listeners, the sense of how deeply embedded diversity was in this pre-World War I social landscape. It took a long time for me to understand, and the way I finally kind of started to understand it was not at this level of regions, but the level of cities and towns. It's a very attractive map. You probably all know the synagogue from Gwóździec, reconstructed in Poland, the beautiful wood kind of baldacchino that was rebuilt. for the museum. This is an ethnographic map of Gvuzdzic itself. Gvuzdzic, now Hvizdets, in southwestern Ukraine. If you look at this, it's hard to see. I apologize for that. Let me see if I have a laser pointer. I normally do a lower tech presentation. But I think you have 4 groups living separate. This is a very small town. This is less than 2,000 people. This is a central square, 4 roads leading in, but you have Ukrainians on the outskirts of town and near town. You have a Jewish neighborhood close to the river, B. You have a Polish neighborhood away from the square, A, and a German neighborhood here on the other side of the southwestern side of the square. So 4 communities, that'd be 3 Christian denominations plus 2 religions, all in a town of maybe 1,000 to 1,500 people. This is, again, sometimes you take a bad photograph of a book and then you're stuck with it because you can never get the book again. So I apologize for this. This is Drohobych in the interwar years. Same kind of, has anyone been to Drohobych? Modern Drohobych? The grid is very much the same. The houses are still the same. But what you don't have, this is interwar. You have a Ukrainian neighborhood leading on the outskirts in blue, Polish off from the side of the square in yellow, Jewish on the other side of the square in red. So again, 3 communities, two Christian denominations, 2 religions, and another small town. This is Kežmarok. This is in Spiš, Eastern Slovakia, a real, as complicated as Eastern Europe gets, historically split between Hungarian lay administration, Polish religious administration for weird reasons. Here's a map of, just get a taste of it. This was also a town that had Germans, Hungarians, Slovaks, and Jews all living side by side. The yellow, this is the interwar Jewish houses in yellow, woven into this tapestry. And if you see, the Jewish population goes from 1,063 in 1938 to 95 to 1 in 2001. But this again only gives you a quarter of the full complexity of what's happening in Kežmarok and around it. This is the local museum in Kežmarok, which actually, these local museums wonderfully illustrates all that history in the old castle. I'll come back to later. So now skip over a very eventful century. This is part of an excellent map in Paul Robert Magoshi's Historical Atlas of Central Europe, which used to be called Historical Atlas of Eastern Europe. He changed it. A fragment of the population movements in 44, 48. And I'll take this, instead of going through an exhaustive list of the inordinate number of population movements, transfers, expulsions, forced immigrations, forced resettlements, to take this as a synecdoche for the amount of population that had to be moved, exterminated, expelled, to create that post-war map, to create the mostly mono-ethnic national map following 45, 48. And of course, omitting the genocide of European Jews and the other massacres of World War II. So that whole fabric, starting in World War I, but essentially really culminating in 39 to 48, gets pulled apart, ripped apart, reshaped, remolded into the world we know today. So now, and this has left Eastern Europe, and I think other parts of the world as well, but especially within Europe, are the Eastern European border regions with this kind of landscape of loss, which you find all over in different manifestations, different configurations. And I think they aren't always brought together. Some, I think, are familiar. The world of Jewish cemeteries is, again, my grandfather's hometown. This could be repeated anywhere across Eastern Europe. The abandoned Jewish cemetery, the cemetery in often very poor shape and physically damaged, looted, broken, and now starting to be reconstructed. But it's not just Jewish cemeteries. This is a place I haven't been, but I would like to go. The Greek Catholic Uniate Cemetery on the Polish-Ukrainian border. I have been close to here in Ustrzyki Dolna. The world of the Boyk and Lemko villages that were cleared out of eastern Poland and forced to settle in the west, or put back over the border to Ukraine. And some lesser known examples. There's a world of German evangelical cemeteries across Poland, which I don't know very well, but across northern Poland, Silesia, the Poniemieckie, the world of evangelical cemeteries. This one's in Upper Silesia, but there are examples all over, kind of left without someone to tend those memories. Then there's repurposing. Synagogue in Inowłódź, which is now a store, but preserves the interior architecture of the synagogue. And you find that in different places. Synagogues uses gymnasia, movie theaters, parlors, all over, repurposed for a new pattern of settlement. The world of ghost signs. It's one of the most evocative kinds, I think, of orphan memory. Lviv being the capital of them, the signs in Yiddish, Polish, German that emerge as the paint comes off, and now have started to attract attention and curation and interest, but for a long time were kind of marooned. The world of pre-war, pre-World War II, pre-World War I, Lviv, kind of emerging this way. This you find in other cities as well. Landscapes of abandoned villages. This is, again, another unit. I think this is a Lemko, this is a Boyko, if this is a Boyko Lemko village in southeastern Poland. Less often you think about places like small town Latvia. This is in Courland. This is in the town museum. Saw this model of the town of Kuldiga, which used to be Goldingen, now 98% Latvian. Once a German town with a Jewish population surrounded by Latvian peasants, and now kind of miniature version of what we're kind of are familiar with from Lviv. The synagogue is a library now. The former German houses have new occupants. The signs, the ghost signs are there as well. But all of that, those landscapes of loss still kind of adhere to the model of the non-site of memory, or the dissonant memory. And I am out of sequence. What I ask is there an even broader category? Are there other kinds of built heritage or unbuilt heritage that have become orphaned? Not just orphaned through the loss of the people who originally built them, originally inhabited them, but orphaned by a loss of support in society, as national narratives and narratives around modernity and the nation state get rewritten. This is the, has anyone been to Toronto? This is the former Enver Hoxha Museum. And actually I can tell in the question and answer, this has been rebuilt in a very interesting way. This is a brutalist post office in Skopje. Skopje has been rebuilt in a very unusual way in the last 20 years. What's the reasons for exclusion? There's I think another category, so beyond these landscapes of loss, a category of places that don't fit in anymore, that have lost a kind of support for different reasons, because they were built by what's now seen as a foreign power, a hostile power, or because they represent a type of modernity or type of utopia that should belong to the past. I think an example of this, and I think this is one we don't talk about very often in this context, The Ottoman heritage in the Balkans. This comes from a wonderful book, Michiel Kiel, Dutch historian of architecture, studies in the Ottoman architecture of the Balkans. He was a stonemason who became fascinated with Ottoman architecture in the Balkans, taught himself Ottoman Turkish, traveled in the 50s, starting in the 60s and 70s across the Balkans, documenting what was at that time, I have to say, not necessarily any longer, but at that time, very much a discarded tradition. So this is from his book, this Ottoman Turkish architecture, misunderstood, neglected, destroyed, which, you know, should ring bells, right? This is, we're not in the category of landscapes of loss necessarily, but we are in the world of the neglected and destroyed. These are from Bulgaria and northern Greece. So, this is at a time in the 80s too, when 15th and 16th century Ottoman relics were being dynamited, bulldozed, just complete or allowed to completely fall apart and crumble. The situation is better now, but I do think there's a lesson in this. And he's talking about Shumen in northern Bulgaria, which medium-sized town in Bulgaria in the 19th century had 40 mosques. In 1980, there were 8. In 1989, so this is recent history, there were only 3. And the other 5 had been either blown up with dynamite or removed by bulldozer. Here's another example. And of course, we could move the boundaries. We could look at Greek remains in Turkey, Armenian remains in Turkey, similar situation, and then even going east. And I'm speeding up because I'm running out of time, and I have a lot of slides. Another modernity that is not rejected, or the other one wasn't a modernity, that was an empire. Now we're into modernities. The world of spomenics has become kind of trendy in the last 10 years. They're in music videos. They've been kind of reclaimed as these iconic post-war abstract sculptures. This is in the 60s, 70s, and then less so in the 80s, Yugoslavia built a galaxy of these different memorials. They're all war memorials, World War II memorials, usually places of partisan battles, and in this radical abstract style. They're very different. They're usually non-representational. They're often in real, sometimes they're in cities, they're often in pretty wild places. And some of them are in great shape, some of them are kept, are still places of memory, and some aren't. This is one in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was, a lot of them suffered during the Yugoslav wars in the 90s. Some have been vandalized since then. This is a monument that was bombed in 2000 on a mountain pass in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Mathian Pass. This is one in Croatia that is slowly being kind of looted or stripped for parts, even though other ones are in great shape. So this is kind of a mixed bag where these are very much monuments of a Yugoslav idea, a Yugoslav national idea, an idea of Yugoslavia being forged as a multi-ethnic community through an anti-fascist struggle. That was the kind of program that all these spomenics adhered to. And now, without Yugoslavia organizing them, some of them are in good shape, some of them are adrift. Someone else's modernity let loose. This one is Petrova Gora, it's in kind of so-so shape. Let me ask the question, are there other modernities that are in the process of being discarded, or are we not thinking about them as historical orphans? This is, again, not a, you should have seen the look on my wife's face when I told her we are not going to Budapest, we are going to Dunajváros to look at the steel mill on vacation, or research trip for me, vacation for her. But the world of massive socialist realist ornament, Stalinist ornament, is it possible to see that as belonging to the world of orphan memory? This is the, so Dunajváros used to be called Stalinváros, Stalin city, the Stalin forge in Hungary. It's still a working steel mill. It just got a big Chinese investment to become more ecologically friendly. But it was also, in the 50s, this massive public art project. It's a monumental mural by Andrzej Domanowski in 55, 56, which you can only get so close to because it is in a working steel mill in the gates. Here's his sketch in the National Museum. And this is more of a question than an answer. How does that world, the world that I think often rejected, but in some places embraced, of socialist realist outdoor sculpture, monument, mosaic. In some places, I think it has some curatorial attention. Some people are interested. In others, I think it is on the way out, a little bit like the Spomenics. It is one of history's orphans, depending on where you are and who you are. How much time do I have? Oh, you don't know how much I have left? No, I know. I can. Do I have 10 minutes? 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Oh, I can keep you.
Yeah, and then we have time for questions as well.
I might push it to 12 or 13, but.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to keep anyone too long. And I am racing. Two approaches to heritage, kind of to now ask, what do we do about orphan memory? This is a beautiful place in Blagaj in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I want to just contrast, for the sake of argument, metaphorically two approaches to thinking about orphan memory and commemoration, and what we should do with them. On one pole is a museum, and the other is the garden or the sod. I really meant orchard, but we'll get to why. I'm losing. Got to recalibrate. This is what I used to write about 10 years ago, before I lost my way and started reading Martin Buber and traveling down dirt roads. I was very interested in museums and in national narratives. One of my first publications was about the House of Terror, or Terrorháza, in Budapest. Had a memorable visit to the Warsaw Uprising Museum. But the musealization of recent history in the post-2000, really. And we've seen this growth of very architecturally adventurous and kind of dramaturgically intense museums that stake a claim to history and try and create an experience out of it. Has anyone been to the Terrorháza? I see a hand in the back. So it's the former secret police headquarters. Before that, fascist police headquarters on Andrassy Street, downtown Budapest. And the centerpiece, it's a museum. You go through the old cells, and there's a whole exhibit about Hungary's history starting in the 30s, moving through the 40s, the 50s. But the center point of the museum is this dramatic elevator ride down into the depths, where you take an elevator ride from the top down into the cellar, down into the underworld. And they really make you feel it, that you're descending into essentially hell, that you're going down into the torture chambers, and then you have a whole experience in the basement. Brilliantly, I think it's brilliantly dramaturgical. It's designed by István Szabó's, the film director's set designer, and has that sense of the theatrical. The Warsaw Uprising Museum, so took my wife there. My wife is very American from Kansas and has no point of reference whenever we go anywhere. And she was totally wowed by it. And the center point of the Warsaw Uprising Museum for me is that crawl through the sewers, that you're being made to not just learn about history, but re-experience it in its most kind of intense, physical way. So this is one approach, and I think we've seen an expansion of musealization of history of certain kinds, and then counter-musealization of narratives being erected in an official way and then challenged with counter-narratives. So that's one kind of paradigm of memory. And I ran into a version of that in an unexpected place, Šiduva, Lithuania, small town, central Lithuania. I was there for family reasons, family history reasons. I have an aunt who loves family history and genealogy, and I do too, and no one else in the family cares, and so we go around, and I didn't do it. Sorry, Šiduva. Downtown Šiduva, small town, Lithuania. our great somebody used to be the royal bailiff in Shadouva, so we were curious if there's anything left. And there wasn't. This is very kind of provincial middle Lithuania. But when we got there, I was stunned to discover that this process of musealization is going on in the central Zmuj, central Samogitia. Does anyone know about this project, the Lost Shtetl Museum, set to open next year? This is a private museum funded by a consortium of people with roots in Shadouva, but no current connection to it. It's under construction. And this is, much like my grandfather's shtetl, a kind of quintessential small-town shtetl with few tangible remains when they started this project. I think 2017, 2018. I was there kind of mid-construction, supposed to open next year. Here's the architect's plan of what it's going to look like. But what was there when I was there, the buildings weren't built. They were, no. So these buildings were just foundations and construction, but what was already in place is this cemetery. And this is sort of virtual cemetery, or real but virtual cemetery. They excavated the former cemetery grounds, found the existing headstones, replaced them, found more headstones in the area, replaced them, and I think added more, and created a reconstruction of the old cemetery. A kind of revived cemetery, which is now then going to be the cemetery in front of the revived shtetl. A kind of virtual, so I'm curious if anyone goes. It's supposed to be open next year. The museum is going to be an interactive experience of what shtetls were like, with Shadouva being the kind of paradigmatic example for this. I think a fascinating progression of this museumizing idea into new non-national areas of memory. But I'm not sure this is the only paradigm we should kind of think about. I'm borrowing the phrase inclusive heritage from someone else. Other paradigms. And so I'm going to use some stuff from the same trip to Lithuania. I have to toggle, sorry. So besides creating these intense experiential driven museums, I think there are a few other approaches to the world of orphan memory. One is restoration. And they all have their valid points. This is actually in the same area of Shadouva. It's all central Lithuania. Lithuania, one way it's notable, it's home to some of the last wooden synagogues. There are few in Latvia, there are very few in Poland. Lithuania has, I think, 17. I think it's the champion in the world of this type of built environment, the wooden synagogue. And you see in the corner, it's the best photograph I get, but the state of the synagogue in 2009. It's been rebuilt, restored. Some of the interior fresco work has been redone, but again, only in fragments, because so much of it was lost. This isn't like Vujets where you repaint the whole thing based on old plans. They had fragments, and they kind of filled in the fragments that remained. So this is restoration. But also, it's another word, of documentation. This is the same region, very small town, very small village really called Rozalimas. I think wonderfully kind of documented the local synagogue, which has been a barn for years and is in poor shape, but is the real thing. And my aunt's opal here for comparison. I'm sorry, I didn't know this was going to be in a presentation slide, so you have a big opal next to a very small synagogue. But in terrible shape, but an incredibly atmospheric place. And in a pretty sleepy place too, but you have these signs that you have the synagogue, the local holy stone, the holy oak, the Catholic church, the local museum, all side by side next to each other. And then you have wild memory. these are just woods. But they're woods on the road to something I found very special, and it's not a great photograph, but the Prophet's house in Bir Shalin. There's a memory that doesn't even have that level of documentation that the Rozaimas synagogue has. That's just kind of out there. And that makes the work we do, I think, so exciting, because there is so much left out there. This was, if you know this story, a Belarusian prophet of the 1930s who proclaimed, but living in the territory of Poland, the Belarusian area near Krinky, close to the border with modern Belarus, whose adherents were mostly Russian Orthodox by religion, mostly Belarusian speakers, and proclaimed not the end of the world exactly, but the coming of the kingdom of God to earth, called Bir Shalin his New Jerusalem. And for a few years in the 30s had this kind of biblically inspired court here in what's now the Knishin Woods, this pretty deep forest, which once had many more villages, and the villages are mostly overgrown or abandoned. And his compound, which is really just an old farm, is there. It was blue. I know it still had its paint in the 90s or in the early 2000s. Now it's increasingly decaying. There actually is a strange kind of little monument next to it, a kind of ecumenical stone circle that someone set up. And there is a certain amount of memory around the spot, but mostly it's left to itself in the woods. And you find places like that, especially places around misfits, people who don't fit into even not just nationalist stories, but also into minority stories that aren't easy to turn into heroes, that are compelling but problematic. This is a different kind of field work. This is Ulcin, Montenegro, and the Albanian, kind of a small majority Albanian pocket close to the Albanian border on the coast in Montenegro. Came here to find this locksmith's house. No, it's not locksmith, it's just a locksmith in front of this parking lot. I'm looking around because I was looking for the grave of Sabbatai Tzvi, the great betrayer, the great heretic, the great apostate of Jewish history, is probably buried behind this locksmith shop. You go behind this, you come here, and there it is. There's his grave. One of the pivotal figures in the last millennium of Jewish history, the figure who proclaimed himself the Messiah, had his adherents around him, eventually apostatized to Islam, but then his greatest adherents believed that he had done so only figuratively, and he remained the Jewish Messiah. Jacob Frank came out of his lineage, first made contact with his adherents in Salonika and Istanbul, and then brought that messianic tradition of Judaism back with him to Poland. If you go to Berat in Albania, you'll find another grave, a beautiful grave, which people will tell you is Sabbatai Tzvi's grave. It probably isn't. It's a beautiful grave. It's by the mosque in the Berat's a beautifully restored, historic kind of citadel, but it probably isn't his grave. There's a dispute about where he's really buried. The Ottoman authorities didn't want a place that would attract too much attention, but this is probably it. And there are things in the land, because the land has its own memory. And I'm wrapping up. Oh, I might skip the last story. Palestina. This is a town, actually maybe 10 miles from the Prophet's house in Bir Shalin. Really just a village. And really when I say village, it's a bunch of corn in a farmhouse somewhere. But this was a Jewish agricultural colony in the 19th century. That's why it has the name. Jews who took over land that was expropriated from monasteries and started farming. Actually, my great-grandfather wasn't from here, but was one of the rare farming Jews. And there's a wonderful book about the Polish borderlands which didn't get much attention, called Jutro Spadną Gromy, by 3 authors, I'll skip their names for now, who interviewed one of the inhabitants, modern-day inhabitants of this place about 10 years ago, and talking about how in Palestina it used to be a town of apple orchards. Jews kind concentrated on growing apples, growing Antonufki, growing apples for sale, and that their apple trees are still growing. You know, in the farm terrain of this town. You could say the same thing about Kolonia Izaka, is same part of the Polish-Belarusian borderland, another agricultural colony. You can actually think these are apple trees. Maybe they're not. Does anyone know vintage trees? This looks like an orchard to me. This is near Adelsk, just over the border. This is Belarus. A more established, more prosperous farming colony that lasted and had a pretty interesting book written about it in the 30s. So actually much larger and longer lasting than Palestina, Kolonia Izaka. Here's another photo, all that's left. And according to a local historian, what's left there now, and I haven't been able to visit, but I have been over the border from it, is a cobblestone street, a few fragmentary buildings, some foundations, and the wild orchards. Those Antonufki, those wild apples, now gone wild, are still there, still in the landscape, still with their own kind of memory. Totally wild, totally untended. And if you bear with me, I will tell a final story and have a moral, and we can debate and discuss. Okay. So going back to Ottoman ruins and holy men and all my favorite things. This isn't a bad scan, this is a good scan of a terrible photograph. This is from Michiel Kiel, that Dutch stonemason. He led me to this place. Babadag, this is the same Babadag as Stashuk's Babadag, but I was there for my own reasons. Although he kind of inspired me, I love that book. The Turba of Sari Saltik Dede, one of the oldest and most venerated and eventually most neglected sites of Balkan Islam. Sari Saltik was probably a real figure. Probably a real figure in the late 13th, early 14th century who brought Islam to the Turkish tribes of the Black Sea littoral in Romania. So this is south of the Danube Delta, kind of the very flat plains there. It used to be kind of a nomadic zone. And he brought Islam there, and then it became a figure of legend, a lot like maybe Joan of Arc, but even more so. And he's become one of the great legendary figures of Balkan Islam, a giant who could change shape, who could preach Christianity to the Christians and then preach Islam to Christians, who could speak any language, who could tame dragons. There's a whole book of Sari Saltik legends. And one of the legends is that he had 7 graves for himself. One of them in Gdańsk, one in Stockholm, but supposedly one in Gdańsk because he kind of conquered all of Eastern Europe for Islam. But some of the graves are real, and this is maybe the oldest one. Ibn Battuta, the great Muslim traveler, visited it, or an earlier version of it, in the 14th century. And an Ottoman emperor rebuilt it in the 16th century, and by the 60s, this is what it looked like. And this is Babadag. Babadag means Father Mountain. This is a very flat area. This is a small hill, but it is the mountain that presides over this town. And recently, I visited in 2019, and it now looks great. It's been beautifully restored. It's been restored by the Turkish International Cooperation and Development Agency. And you find this all across the Balkans, places of religious significance, Muslim significance in Serbia, North Macedonia, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Romania, have been, in the past 10 years, 15 years, but especially the past 10 years, even in Budapest, restored by the Turkish Development Agency, restored very nicely. This is a view inside. This is Sari Saltik's presumably restored new grave for him. He's 700 years old, and he has 7 graves, but it's nice to see a nice new one. And very nicely done and a little bit sterile. There's not a lot of action going around this tomb. Although it was once one of the great pilgrimage sites certainly in Romania, but in the whole Balkans. And the Cyrisaltic cult in parts of the Balkans is still very much alive, like in Albania, in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But outside the town, up, now we're going up on Babadag, up on the Father Mountain. There's something else going on. And to get there, you walk through this dwarf oak forest, old cork oaks. There's no real path. The path has been, people who know about the path know it. And at the top of the mountain, you find this Koyun Baba. Turbeshi is a kind of mausoleum. Koyun Baba originally is another Islamic saint, Turkoman saint, the father of sheep. He was a shepherd in central Anatolia. And the legend is that he came to Babadag to find Cyrisaltic's grave, restored it, performed some other miracles, and then is buried here. In reality, he's another real saint. He's probably buried in Anatolia, but the cult here is very much alive. And there's a legend about it that if you tear your clothes, he can grant you wishes. So the trees around this grave are full of of rags and clothes and beads and pieces of cloth. There's no marked path to it. There's no Turkish development fund, but there is the living cult of the saint up high in the mountain. And so to end this, about orphan memory, I kind of want to remind myself, really, that one person's orphan can be another person's child. That when we're doing this work, or trying to restore memory, to be careful that that in doing so, we aren't creating something artificial. That we aren't creating, paving over a garden and putting in a parking lot. That whenever we try and place a museum somewhere, that we aren't at the same time, or a shrine, or a monument. That we aren't trampling the existing paths of memory, the existing kind of garden of the numinous underfoot of what we want to enshrine and commemorate and remember. That's it.
Please think about comments and questions. Maybe I will start with first question, short question. So about this comparative perspective. So what do you think is distinct in this region? So is your message that these problems of forgetting and or embedding in the past, or I don't know. So these processes you describe, or this non-places of memory, or some agencies of people in this region are distinct from other regions of the world. So so probably you talked about this experience, about these pictures to people from other parts of the world, for example, in the US. And so in other parts of the world, there were also genocide, there were wars, there were mass migration. And so is Eastern Europe, is this part of the world you describe somewhat different or distinct for you from other parts, or not?
I think it is. I think it has commonalities in part of the world and is distinct from other parts of the world. So I think there's a real difference with, say, Western Europe and North America, and even which has had its wars, has had its massacres, even I lived in California for a long time, really genocide. But this idea of a kind of an old tapestry, of a multi-layered, multi-part settled communities very rapidly being unraveled. I think that's specific to a part of the world, not only to Eastern Europe, but kind of the old world of land empires, which have a different dynamic than colonialism, have a different than overseas colonies. I think there's something else, this kind of slow buildup of people living side by side for many centuries and then being torn apart. I think it's very similar to other parts of the world. I think it's very similar to the Middle East, really, the northern part of the Middle East. So northern Mesopotamia, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, the Caucasus, Eastern Anatolia, actually Anatolia and Greece, that has a very similar dynamic of a world kind of building up, almost like a coral reef, and then being ripped apart within the space of living memory. I think that there's a kind of a watershed of living memory that kind of goes back to the oldest person you know, their memories, and the things that they remember. So the 20th century, so for me, I think my grandfather was born in 1911, and the oldest memories he had would go back to the 1880s, 1890s. It's kind of a watershed of inherited memory, of inherited direct oral tradition, and all of that destruction happens within that watershed. I think so. Is India, Pakistan fits into this Eastern European model in a real way. If you look at what's left of Sikh and Hindu buildings in Pakistan, and then vice versa on the other side of the border, that sudden rupture within living memory, leaving all these kind of stranded orphans, that's something in common. So there's a kind of band, I think, in Eurasia that shares some in common. I think orphan memory, you could extend it to all kinds of places all over the world, but there's something in that dynamic that leaves whole landscapes that are inhabited within, that space of 3 generations, 4 generations, that's shared by part of the world. That is a little bit, it's hard to, I think, translate to, I'll tell you what, it's hard to translate to Oregonians, even though they should think about commonalities. I don't think it's an easy thing to map to, I gave a version of this talk in Oxford, different talk in Oxford, and in the very settled world of Oxfordshire, there's many things the British did overseas, but within those home counties, I don't think it fits as well.
A question, comment?
Thank you so much for that lecture, and I enjoyed it a lot because it resonates with some things that I wrestle with myself in my academic and practical work. And there was one more term that came to my mind when you went through the terms. It's unsettled memory by Yehiel Weizmann. But I think I wanted to ask you, in the specific context of the Jewish memory, I sometimes think that maybe we also deal with orphaned heritage and displaced memory. Because when I think of that the Jewish memory of East Central Europe very much continued, but in a form, for example, of Eat-Score books and various practices of remembering, but it was just disattached from the place itself, the heritage state and the very geography where it was, and then the memory was sort of continued without any connection to that particular site. So this is something that comes to my mind. And also, I had the pleasure of working with Rama Sendika on non-sites of memory. And what we found interesting is obviously these sites are not commemorated, but are not forgotten either. And what we realized after 4 years of a research project that led to the books we wrote about that is that what we sort of overlooked was the vernacular memory, because there is this, let's say, displaced memory of the people who left this particular geography, but we also realized that there is a local vernacular memory related to that site. That is a memory of people who did not belong to the community that created this heritage. And I run a Jewish foundation in Poland that is dealing with uncommemorated burial sites of Holocaust victims. And we are able to locate these burials outside the camps and outside the cemeteries because of local non-Jewish Polish communities remembering about them, and what is even more, marking them in the landscape. So there is a strange, vernacular form of memory that is still somehow attached to this heritage. And I think this is interesting. Yeah. So this is just some of the things that I think about when I think of this concept of orphan memory that I really liked. And I wonder, how much this is orphan memory and orphan heritage, and then a memory that exists in some different geographical context or, in a different mode.
I think that's a wonderful question. I think I'm going to respond to it with a brief story, which I think is an annoying habit of mine. But you mentioned the Eat-Score books. I think it's fascinating how much I think we in the present want to connect memory to landscape and memory to place and restitch them together. but they often flow completely independently of each other, or flow independently for a very long time. So my grandfather was from Zambrów, and had very fond memories, pre-World War II memories of Zambrów, which, if anyone has been to, is a pretty blank place now. It was really completely destroyed in World War II, and he never went back. He lived in Warsaw until through the late 90s, never went back, never made the trip back, but he had a Yizkor book, a book published in Israel, published in Yiddish, which none of us could read, and a book full of stories of his parents, grandparents, and the kind of the wider family. It's kind of prominent, locally prominent family, and kind of everyone knew each other, and Zambrów was pretty small. So he would pore over this Yizkor book. The memory was in the book and not in the place. And then randomly my aunt, who isn't other side of the family, now lives outside Zambrów, and I spent a lot of time there, and I've tried to, and the Yizkor book was published in English. I don't read Yiddish. But then I went into it, and I'm trying to connect memory to place. But for him, they became completely distinct. He had his memory of the world in the 20s, and then he had the book after the 60s. And the two didn't touch, except, in his mind. So thank you for that. Great question.
Any questions?
Thank you so much. It's really brilliant and responsible. Somehow, I feel like you did justice to what's on site somehow. So I'm a visual artist, but I also research especially the aspect of the modern heritage of Skopje. I'm from Skopje. So anyway, that all aside, my mind is buzzing a bit. But first, I wanted to ask you, why didn't you use the verb orphaned? What was that like? Because I feel like there is something, and you really nicely explain as to how this all starts, or how does it unfold, and where's the responsibility? Yeah, that's okay. I'm not going to answer for it. I'll be curious. And then second was, as you were closing the lecture, and in relationship to this slide, and in relationship to the responsibility, you said something and I missed it. So would you mind if you sort of tell me, what did you really say at the end? Because I'm eating myself, because I didn't hear you very well.
But I say things and they immediately fall out of my mind. So let's hope I can take a few steps back. The first part of the question I'll answer first, and then I'll try to go back, is a great one because I struggled with this orphan versus orphan memory. And I think orphaned is probably grammatically better, but orphan sounds better. So that's not a great answer. But I try to justify it to myself because I had to make that choice. And there's something I like about the noun phrase, which floats a little bit free of agency and allows, because I think there's a pathos in the place and the object that's a little bit independent of the agent working on it. And I like that, but I think I'm not wrong grammatically. I think it should be orphaned. But when you run into it in the field, to me, that they are orphans. They aren't orphaned. So that's not a very satisfying, that's a writer's answer, not a theoretician's answer. Yeah. And I don't have a better one, but I actually kind of sat and wondered which one of those should it be. At the end,
because you did use it in the talk interchangeably.
I did a little bit because I'm not totally clear on where it should fall. So and I would love feedback on that. At the very end here with the Kohen Baba shrine, it's a little bit, I was speaking against, I think, museums and musealization, just to keep in mind that there's a world, one person's orphans are another people's children. And that to be careful not to pave over what is still living, not to put it in this box, that we try and restore and rebuild these landscapes. And I think that's very valuable work, and the work of making them legible. but not at the same time to go too far into disrupting that vernacular ecosystem. That world of living vernacular memory is there, and that should also be nourished. And you can go too far. The Shaduva, the Lashtetl Museum is kind of fascinating to me. I'm waiting to see what it looks like, because it is this kind of, to me, in construction, it looks like this space station being beamed down into this town of 1,000 people in central Lithuania. And I'm wondering, and I think they're doing, from the website, they're doing work to connect it to the place and connect it to the people. But there is an element of this bizarre mushroom sprouting out of nowhere. And to be cognizant in any kind of project like that, there's this whole world under the surface, even, in Babadag, up on the hill, up in the woods, there's things that are remembered that don't show up in books, that don't show up in histories. I don't know if that's what I said, but that's where I was going.
So, hello, thank you for the talk. It was a real pleasure to listen to it, and very interesting facts I was totally unaware of. I'm not very professionally linked to this, at all, so just an interested citizen. So my question is, are there any examples of positive examples of communities being built after reconciliation, and how do they work as communities on preserving these memories? To me, when you talked about this, an island came to my mind. I'm Croatian, and there's an island where there was a large Italian community which had to leave after the World War II. And then they mostly settled in Venice, as far as I know. And now they are somehow collaborating, I guess, with the community who was left on the island. They're, of course, in Venice better off financially, and there are foundations in which they are not just building museums, but I guess as a community also contributing to preserving biodiversity, because that's also part of the memory, especially on this island, or dolphins around the island and so on. So there's a community which is actually, despite of all the historical problems, they managed to, as a community, then work together towards preserving the memories and building on it, despite of the challenges. So I'm wondering, are there any examples like that? And maybe if you could share them with us. Thank you.
I think there are plenty of positive examples, small and large. I'd say two kind of areas where I was impressed. I'm going to kind of leave aside, but I'm too invested in Poland. I've kind of been too within a Polish mentality to consider Poland. Although there's a lot of positive things happening in Poland, I'm also too emotionally bound up in things. So leaving Poland aside, I was very impressed in Lithuania at the work that's been done to make different landscapes legible in a world that, in a country that has lost the vast majority of its kind of pre-World War II diversity. Not all of it, but a lot of it. Everywhere you go in Lithuania, you see monuments of places and these granite boulders marking sites of mass executions, genocide, but also Russian imperial spots, pagan hills, pagan forts, Jewish bathhouses, Jewish houses of worship, Jewish prayer halls. That example of and Rozalimas is a tiny place. And everyone's over 65. But this kind of work of making landscape visible, I thought I was very impressed in fairly kind of remote places. I kind of followed the valley of the Nieszwiecz. This is Czesław Miłosz's Dolina Isy, up to Krakow, to Shaduva, and then further north towards the Lithuanian-Latvian border, and found an incredible wealth of things just in the land. The other place, Albania, in terms of kind of, and I don't mean this to be an invective against museums, Albania has some of the most creative, architecturally innovative, and kind of ingenious ways of bringing small amounts, working with a small amount of inherited cultural patrimony and making it visible and accessible. There's a museum in Shkodra, old Italian Scutari, northern Albania, photography museum. There's a multi-generational kind of dynasty of town photographers in Shkodra. There's an Italian man started it, passed it on to his Albanian apprentice, passed it on to his son, who passed it on to his son. So from the 1840s through the Hoxha years, one kind of lineage took all the town's portrait and photos, and they have this big collection of negatives. And they created a very kind of innovative small museum that on one level is this history of the town through photography, through these very specific individuals' photography, and at the bottom is an art gallery that solicits work kind of about the town and about wider issues, and in a kind of ingenious light box, in a place that has kind of troubled reputation. If you remember, the 90s used to be the capital of the blood feud in Albania, and now it's this, I think, model, like, local heritage museum. And a lot of that, actually, Albania was really impressive in how much is being done in presenting heritage in an architecturally adventurous but accessible way with very modest means. So those are two I'd point out. And I'd love to know more about the Croatian island that you're talking about.
Thank you very much for this very panoramic view of so-called Eastern Europe. And I have to recognize that I was really struck by this category. It seems to me extremely vintage and operational only in Western world. So your speech was extremely Western to me, because being historian and living in Warsaw and working with Romanian sources, Romania is my field of research. I don't have at all the imaginary like it is the Eastern Europe as the totality. For example, we are in the Eastern Berlin, so we are in the Eastern Europe. And like 1 mile from this place, it will be Western Europe. And for example, in Poland, I always protest, like the people are calling Western Europe the places like southern Italy, Germany, Scandinavia, and Portugal. This is not at all Western Europe. This is only the notion. And being historian, I see more differences between, for example, Albania and Czech Republic than between Italy and Albania. So what's the north, what's the south, what's the western, what's the eastern? I recognize that this could be very operational, for example, in United States. But this is the same with, for example, Southern America. Mm-hmm. This is not the totality, but we have the like tendency to present it like the land. And this is one remark. And the second is, of course, I recognize that this is extremely difficult to call the parts of Europe. And in Poland, for example, we have the tendency to exaggerate our Central European vibe. We are not the Eastern Europe, we are the Central Europe, and this is very important. But this is maybe a little bit hilarious thing, but on the other side, this is really important, because this is I think for a lot of people, not only like the popular class, but the elites too, this is extremely important to be recognizable, like the difference. And the same tendency in the West. They call us the Eastern Europe because we are the totality for them, and we call them the Western Europe because this is the other land. How to depass, how to destroy this difference? This is my question. And like hearing you, I have more and more the impression that we need to make it somehow, but how and when and why, I don't know. Thank you.
I do have an answer, and it is in book format. It's Goodbye, Eastern Europe. It is the premise of the book that Eastern Europe is a category that's been vacated and is now increasingly only operational in the West and in a kind of retrograde perspective, in that much of the, at a national level, it is something that people are fleeing from as a category towards Central Europe, towards the Adriatic, kind of wider Nordic or Scandinavian region, some permutation of the Black Sea or the Western Baltic, that no one wants to be the last person in Eastern Europe, except me, apparently. I am that last person. I am that Western, backwards-looking view. And I think everything you said is right, and yet I think there is value in restoring something positive in an idea of an Eastern Europe, that there was and this is a little bit the theme of the book, that despite itself there was an achievement of coexistence and a particular way of being that was lost and is being lost and then can be remembered and can be recaptured. And so it is, I was talking to Mateusz about nostalgia. There is a nostalgia, and that comes in part from being a minority or half minority group. That world of Polish Jewishness is alive, but so diminished. And so it is hard to just say, to just completely embrace the present without any qualifications, and to see nothing of value in an earlier part, and to say, we're now moving into, different geopolitical currents. There is something and maybe only I, I'm the last person on the raft, but that is the idea of the book, and that is why it's goodbye in the title and not hello, even though I might be saying hello.
So is there any from Eastern Europe in the audience asking?
Yeah. I do have strong connection to the feeling of Eastern Europe as opposed to being in where I first started here in Europe in West Berlin. And I have this question because I just coincidentally had this experience to work with a building in Prenzlauer Berg that is a former Jewish orphanage. And we were doing film screenings this summer about migration and discrimination and racism. And what was odd, though, to me is that working with this place they put up this history that it's this Jewish orphanage, it isn't really, there's no Jewish culture being so much invited into this space to bring that culture back. And so I'm wondering if, as maybe a sensitive topic at the moment, but this sort of memory culture thing versus like lived experience to the place, as you're saying, this orphan, trying to maybe reclaim this orphan culture that you feel this connection to. And is there, I don't know how much you've researched places in Berlin, but like this, there's this feeling that these kinds of places have not been properly restored to what should be there as a memorial to this Jewish orphanage, because there's too much focus on this Middle Eastern project in the Jewish project, and not so much really inviting or welcoming the Jewish diaspora to come and participate in the Berlin spaces where there was a rich diaspora.
It's hard for me to speak to Berlin specifics, Berlin realities, which I don't know that much about. I'm very much, that all comes back to Warsaw, to me. Warsaw and Krakow, but really Warsaw. But I think I hear what you're saying in the sense that, there are different kinds of virtualizations of memory. I think what your question was about, that kind of disconnection between memory and place and lived culture and imagined culture. You feel that very vividly in Krakow. The world of seeing Warsaw and Krakow become kind of sites of a very restricted kind of tourism that is very wary to engage with the local place sometimes, or does so in a very mediated way. At the same time, memory is so specific. You know, this is the problem. Like memory and culture, everyone has their own template of what it should be. I had, you know, for me, it's all personal. Where my grandparents lived, where their grandparents lived, I kind of knew. You know, my grandfather would show me the places where his father was a suspenders maker in Muranov, in the Kertzlock market. He could show me kind of roughly where it was and where his house was. He used to have a house. They lived in an apartment near Platz Bankove, where he showed me kind of, he could look over a wall and see there was a prison. He could see the prisoners exercising, and all of that's gone. Even the place like my mom's aunt was in prison, was executed in Warsaw on Gamsha Street. That's gone. That whole grid, that whole street grid is gone. You can kind of walk around. On one hand, it's a city that's just alive with memory. On the other hand, physically, the post-45 Warsaw and the pre-39 Warsaw don't line up. They don't match up. And there's no way to really make them except with, you know, with GPS and with books. But you can't, you know, it's a whole world of streets that have vanished, especially kind of in the former ghetto in the West. There are places of contact, and there are places where you kind of have to feel your way, almost with a divining rod, to find those past spaces. For a long time, for me, you know, like some things are more eloquent than others. There's a whole Jewish cultural world in Warsaw, which I know, and Jewish Warsaw is very small, and I'm related to half of them, and not everyone likes each other. And everyone's like everyone is writing a memoir, including me, I guess. But you know, what contains memory? And it's like, on one hand, there's that impulse to bring people in and to engage and to educate. But for me, you know, there was this block on Pruzhina Street that had the 19th century tenements, had that old brickwork, kind of like the brickwork that I started off with. I'm not going to go all the way back, but the Ger in Gura Kalvaria, the kind of rotting 19th century, that, you know, Tsarist era red brick, and that to me spoke of the past. Did it really? It had some connection, you know, it had that tangible feeling of like, and that's, you know, that's turning into skyscrapers. And for my sake, I wish they wouldn't. For my sake, I wish I could have my landscape of memory and my grandparents' landscape of memory. But that's also impossible. So you try to write, you know, against the current of time and program against the current of time, and it's never going to be fully satisfying for everyone. But I'd love to know more where the, you know, how the orphanage you're at, how it's negotiating these currents which really run in opposition. There's like a local memory, there's a world Jewish memory, there are obligations to present social crisis, and they all cut in different directions. That's why I love the kind of stuff in the, you know, the apple trees in the fields, which might be romantic, but they also have their memory, and they live their life, and they have that stuff persists on its own calendar, in its own time, even if no one's looking at it. I don't think that was satisfactory at all. I think that was just rambling, but I hope I answered some of that question.
I just have a tiny little kind of note on the side. You are definitely not the last person to kind of stick to the concept of Eastern Europe, and actually a lot of young generation, youth scholars and students in Poland actually are attempting to reclaim this category, as they see that, well, they kind of re-evaluated the notion of Central Europe, and they don't really align with that. So maybe that's some sort of consolation that you are not the last to extend.
It is consolation to me. I love to hear the pendulum swing in my direction.
Yeah, and
yeah,
and thank you so much for this fascinating lecture. I also had in mind while listening to you the notion of prosthetic memory. I'm not sure if it's like, if it's anyhow, like, do you find it anyhow relatable? But yeah.
I love the phrase. I don't think I'm familiar with the idea. Could you expand on prosthetic memory a little bit.
Yeah, I'm also not the expert on that. Something like I stumbled upon because I'm kind of more working with affective memory, but it's basically like idea of well, when the community no longer has an direct access to memories of like certain historical, also traumatic events, like the passing and disseminating the knowledge of those of these events by, like, I don't know, like fiction or film or anything like that, make this kind of prosthetic and enables the members of this community to kind of see this experience as part of like their own history, basically, something like that.
Okay, you know, there's this, and this is just my attempt to stick an oar in, but there is a nest of related terms, I think, from different directions. There's so much, what I'm calling orphan memory, but other people are calling displaced memory or distant memory or unsettled memory or the non-place of memory, that from different directions, from different disciplines, we're trying to name different ways in which that ideal collective memory that Halbach describes, most of what we study veers very far away from it. That Halbach's model is everything the landscape speaks to the collective. The collective vivifies, makes the landscape come to life. And I think it is a peculiarity of this part of the world that in so many ways that's not true. In so many ways people erect simulacrums, have prostheses, have something uncanny either in the objects that they live with or the memories that they reach for. And that we're all trying to name different versions of that without settling on we don't have a single name that encompasses all of these. This is kind of an attempt at an umbrella to encapsulate, to encompass some of it, but it'd be great, if people could navigate through that thicket and bring all these together. And I am, I'm a historian, but I'm not a theorist. I do a little bit of theory. I don't have that, level of Roma Syndica or Halbach's or Pierre Nora. I don't, when it gets into philosophy, I get a little woozy. But hopefully, it's the younger generation of scholars that will fill that in and find ways to give better names, better language for these phenomena.
So maybe one more question.
Thank you. Thank you for this lecture. It brought to my mind a slightly philosophical thought about how this concept of orphan memory, really as an orphan in my memory, let's put it this way, could be operationalized in a certain specific case. And that would be my question of what do you think about it? It could apply to people whose ancestors assimilated. This is how I imagine this. As by this, you always had an orphan in your memory, in your family memory, or especially when the language is lost, for instance, or the culture. So in this instance, I find it like particularly vivid, especially if you are in a position of reclaiming this. So you are, in a way, adopting this orphan, this former orphan, and trying to revive it, like this object, those remnants, to the level that is possible. As you said, it's never satisfactory. Thank you.
That's fascinating, the idea of kind of repatriating your own ancestors. And I think that's true for a lot of people who, it's kind of true for me. Although in the reverse, I grew up surrounded by the Jewish part of my family and knowing very little about the Polish part that kind of been separated out. And actually going to Shaduva was part of that, trying to figure out, you know, I had family from Vilno and family from Gniezno, but they didn't have, for family reasons or for just reasons of actual orphanage. My grandmother was an orphan. All her sisters died. Those parts of the family tree were cut off, and they didn't communicate outside. And I think that's another, it's not exclusive to the region, but it's common in the region that you have those inter-ethnic, inter-religious, inter-political marriages that produce ghost lineages. There's an idea in evolution of ghost lineages where you can't trace how something evolved. And the work, kind of cultural or personal work of filling those out falls under, I think, this umbrella. I have to think more about that. I think that's a fascinating idea. Thank you for the remark.
So I think many thanks, Jakob, for sharing with us. So this journey, with these pictures, this all broken materiality of remembrance, this forgetting and some sort of nostalgia about this world you portrayed for us. I think this is something really interesting. Maybe in this relation, so looking at from the network perspective, so that there is something not exactly in this materiality and this people, but also in the relation between how communities of current communities, so communities now, are looking to the past or are relating themselves to the people who lived there in the past. And I think this is a very interesting story, and we thank for that. And I thank also to all of you, to the audience, for all the comments, all the questions, and all the lively discussion. So many thanks.
Thank you so much for being a patient audience and for the excellent questions. Really a pleasure for me. Thank you.